Hi, everyone. We're just going to give a few minutes for everyone to join. Thank you. Okay, we're going to get started in about uh, 30 seconds. All right, let's get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Um, so, um, this webinar is going to be about OPWDD and adult decision making. But before we get into the content, I'd like to introduce myself and my colleagues. So my name is Alex Elagoon. I am the director of the post-secondary readiness transition team here at Advocates for Children. and my colleague Juliet is joining us today. Juliet, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Juliet Eisenstein. I'm the Assistant Director of the Post-Secondary Readiness Project at AFC.
So, thank you, Juliet. So, as you all see by our agenda for today, we're going to be talking about OPWD and adult decision making. Now, this is going to be very much from a perspective of transition-based services. And so we talk about transition, we mean transition from high school or secondary school to kind of post-secondary life, what happens after school. So the world of OPWDD is very broad. It offers all kinds of medical services and health supports, but we're mostly going to be focusing on how can you continue in your life's journey from an educational, vocational, and kind of employment perspective. We have about an hour today. OPWDD, could be a 6 month long class or lecture, so we're going to cover it at a pretty high level. But hopefully, there's some resources at the end that can help you, and there's a lot of organizations throughout the city that are really specialists in OPWDD, and for certain parts, you're welcome to call us at Advocates for Children, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So, what is Advocates for Children? Advocates for Children is a organization that supports education rights and students with disabilities, primarily in the New York City Department of Education or in services related to the New York City Department of Education. We help secure special education services. We help with various forms of advocacy to make sure students are getting the proper supports and services that they need. We have a variety of different teams, or from an early childhood team to charter schools to immigrant students' rights teams. So um, um, if you need to reach us, we do have a helpline that is available, and you see the number on the screen. That is a way to get fast resource and fast assistance to certain questions that you have. And we also have guides and resources, workshops and trainings, and we do offer free legal services in some cases, depending on the nature of the situation. So this training and Advocates for Children do focus on New York City. So everything is relative to New York City. Throughout the state of New York or outside of New York, things tend to be a little bit different. So keep that in mind. So we're going to start off by talking about OPWDD, the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities. So what is OPWDD? OPWDD is a state agency that is primarily funded by Medicaid that helps people of all ages with intellectual and developmental disability. Now, there's many different IEP classifications or different forms of disability that could qualify someone for OPWDD, but pretty much anyone with a developmental disability that substantially impacts one or more areas of their life, whether it's communication or daily living skills, would be eligible. A lot of the diagnoses that we talk about when even are listed on the OPWDD website, we're talking about cerebral palsy, autism, Prader-Willi syndrome, Down syndrome, and many, many others. And there's also ways to qualify, not on the basis of diagnosis per se, but on functional assessments and kind of based on different scoring. And by the way, if anyone has any questions, feel free to just throw the question up. I'm happy to stop or answer things at the end as we go along. So I'm going to talk about some of these other things, care coordination and services, but this is just to kind of get us warmed up. To know some terms that are commonly referred to in the context of OPWDD is the Developmental Disabilities Regional Offices, the DROs. These are the offices that often process applications. They are the offices that oversee the care coordinators and nonprofit providers, and it's kind of like when you think about it as a local office for the OPWDD agency, which itself is located in Albany. When we talk about transition planning, this is the concept of planning for adulthood for students with disabilities. Students' goals for adult life can include college, vocational education, employment, adult services, independent living. Those are all things that that OPWDD can assist with in various ways, and we're gonna talk about that. By the way, this is the fourth installment of a transition series that we've been running since November 2023. So our first part was transition planning on the IEP and how that works. Then we discussed college access and how that works for students with disabilities. And about sometime in March, we had an employment and access VR webinar. So some of the things that overlap with OPWDD we've discussed previously. So we're going to be focusing primarily on OPWDD and services related to it. But as I mentioned things, I may reference back to presentations that we done as part of the series, and they're all online and available for viewing. So the last thing I'll mention is care coordination organizations. Those are these generally referred to as CCOs, and they're very, very, they are the providers that OPWDD works with to do everything from eligibility and submitting your application to authorizing services, to finding providers, to finding service providers. So CCOs are kind of the hands-on agency that authorizes a lot of the services. So eligibility, as I discussed here a little bit more concretely, you have to have a diagnosis of a developmental or intellectual disability. The disability has to have happened before the age of 22. Disability is expected to be permanent, and the disability impacts the child's ability to live everyday life independently. So we'll talk a little bit more about what this means and what kind of documentation you need to kind of prove this or to show this for purposes of eligibility. Generally, the required documentation is a psychological evaluation report within the last 3 years. It should have a full IQ score as well as adaptive behavior skills. Now, some of these slides are going to be a little bit technical. I'm going to go through them quickly because it's not something per se that you need to know. And I mean, you do need to know, but a lot of times you will go to a provider who knows this or agencies that are familiar with. So for the purposes of time, I'm going to try to stick to the things that are most relevant, but the information is here, and it is also some that is up on the OPWDD website. So when you talk about the psychological evaluation and the IQ score, I mean, generally, there are certain standards that OPWDD looks at for OPWDD eligibility, and when you're talking about IQ scores above or below 60 or 70, there's different reports or different follow-up questions that they may have that you may need to supplement your initial application. You do need a social history or psychosocial evaluation reported within 1 year of the application date. And this is important for them to kind of understand the context of the student or child's kind of journey and recent history. A medical report, such as one from an annual physical or a doctor, and then you need the actual form, the transmittal form, which is generally what we call the OPWDD application. I'm going to keep going, but if you have more questions on eligibility, there's certain agencies and the CCOs that are really specialists on it that can help you. But this is just meant to give you some preliminary information. There are also Article 16 clinics where you can have evaluations done.
Alex, you're muted. Alex, you're muted.
Apply for. Here is just some of the clinics that do offer free services. Again, there generally is a waiting list, but something you should be aware of and use as a resource. Additionally, the diagnostic evaluation, I'm not going to get into this too deeply, but when we present this training to psychologists or other kind of clinicians, these are some of the things to be aware of in terms of scales and other forms of measurement and assessment that OPWDD looks at when they're trying to understand the impact of a disability and the functional level of someone who's applying. So care coordination organizations, I've mentioned them already. There's three. There's Advanced Care Alliance, there's Care Design, and Tri-County. These three CCOs would, I'll talk about the eligibility piece, but generally when you work with them, they help you apply, then you get a care navigator or care coordinator. through one of these agencies who then works with you to get services in place. So we're going to look at the variety of services that are available in a few minutes, but it's important to know that everything in the world of OPWDD generally goes through CCOs. So the last part kind of goes into the next slide, but I'm going to talk about it, which is when you want to apply for OPWDD, you need to choose a CCO and work through a CCO. They will not only help you guide you through the OPWDD eligibility process, they will also submit the application on your behalf. So if you look at this kind of slide here that kind of shows you the process, I know it looks a little bit confusing, but if you start on the left, you schedule, the first steps are schedule and get all your documents together, schedule an evaluation, get documents in place. You have to watch, you can watch it virtually now, you don't have to go in person. That was a recent rule change, a front door session. So that is available on the OPWDD website. We have a link coming up where you can, when you watch the videos, that fulfills the requirement. It's supposed to give you information about understanding how to become OPWDD eligible. And the front door is ultimately the eligibility portal or mechanism that OPWDD processes or evaluates applications through. Next, you connect, once you have when you watch the front door, you have your documentation together, you connect with the CCO, they look over your application, they help you put everything together. Then the CCO submits the required documentation on your behalf to the local DDRO. So that is the local OPWDD office. You generally receive an eligibility determination from the DDRO that can take a few months. If you're approved, then you move forward to having an interview. You select the CCO, you request a care manager, and services get implemented. If you're denied, there is an appeal process. There's a several part appeal process. I'm not going to cover it for the sake of time today, but you do have the right to appeal a decision if you are denied services. So the application process, again, this is very similar to that chart. It just breaks it down a little bit more, so I'm not really going to cover it in too much depth, but this is the process. It's very important that you understand the process can take anywhere from 6 to 9 months to over a year, especially depending on your documentation and kind of other things. And I'm talking about from the point of evaluating to the point of submitting. So one of the things that we always like to talk about or mention in terms of process and timeline is start early, especially if you have a student who is going to be graduating from school in the next year or two. We highly recommend that you start the OPWDD services application as far in advance as possible, because often what happens is a student will graduate and then the family or the student or the who's ever supporting them says, okay, let's get OPWDD. Then that could take a year, and a lot of times the student has a major gap where, when you're talking about someone who's 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, 21 years old, if they lose a year of education or services, it can be incredibly detrimental. And it's one of the major things that we at Advocates for Children advocate for when we talk to the Department of Education and schools throughout the New York City area. How can we get students to apply both for OPWDD and access VR services as much in advance as possible, so that by the time you graduate, there's a seamless transition, and OPWDD services that we're going to talk about in the next slide are ready to serve you. So here we're talking about two different kind of pillars or two different kind of arms of OPWDD and the services they provide. There's generally what are called family support services, and then there's home and community-based Medicaid waiver services. So for certain family and support services, you just need OPWDD eligibility, and it's a more limited set of services that we'll see on the next slide. But if you're really looking for the full gamut of OPWDD, which means the Medicaid-based services, you have to qualify for Medicaid. And qualifying for Medicaid comes with all kinds of income tests and financial tests and kind of other things. But if you're talking about services like home care, if you're talking about services like day hab, or you're talking about services like that, you will need to qualify through the Medicaid channel, which again means that sometimes a student or a young person can qualify pretty easily, but Medicaid does have some pretty stringent financial restraints, and you should think about that as you're thinking about OPWDD eligibility. So we're going to look on the next slide as to what falls under each one of these categories. So under family support, you have I guess a simpler list of services, which is respite, various forms of training, reimbursement for certain items, some home modifications that sometimes may or may not qualify under Medicaid as well, and certain recreational and social activities. Now, even though, and just to take a slight pause, is so we are talking about a high level of the services that are available. Once you start talking through the CCOs and you're approved, for each one of these things, they either have a guideline which you would follow, so you'd have an expense, and then the agency would um, um, reimburse you, or they have providers. So there's different providers that provide community have, there's different daycare providers. So the CCOs connect you with the providers, and the providers work with you to set up a tailored plan for your student or child. So notably, the major list of services are the services you see here on the right, which is community have, day have, residential programs, employment supports, housing, crisis services, intensive behavioral support, adaptive equipment, home care services. So these services are a pretty big deal. They can be incredibly helpful, and it's I'm going to talk about it because some of these services I'm going to go into one by one. I do really want to explain as to, what does this look like potentially? What do some of these services look like for somebody who maybe is 35 or 40 years old and has intellectual developmental disability? And what does this look like for somebody who is 17 or 18 or 19 or 20? And I don't mean that from a perspective of folks who are older aren't, trying to be progressive or get their education, but there's certain providers and certain programs that are more tailored toward younger folks and folks that are trying to achieve an employment goal or a vocational goal, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to send them through the chat or through the Q&A, and I'm happy to pause and answer anything that I can. So this is a slightly longer list because this actually includes the services that fall under Medicaid generally. So Medicaid covers all kinds of things like PT, OT, doctors, dentists, nurses, health services. So that is all also covered under OPWDD, generally under its Medicaid coverage arm. So equipment, transportation, care coordination, all these kind of things. And what's important to note is that the budget for these is generally unlimited. You have to work with a provider. There are standards for medical necessity. But when we talk about self-direction, a little bit further in this training, you're going to see that self-direction works a little bit differently. It's a very specific budget that you have to work with, whereas the traditional services aren't budget-based. So even home care services, which someone might be getting 24 hours around the clock, that comes with a significant cost, but it's a traditional OPWDD service, so there's no quote-unquote budget limit. Now, not everyone may get 24-hour home care because a provider or a medical provider determines that you don't have the medical need for it, but it's something important to be aware of. All these services are provided through different agencies. So even PT has to accept OPWDD Medicaid or has to accept Medicaid, summer camps, day camps, community programs. They have to be an approved provider through OPWDD. This can take quite a while. A lot of providers are at capacity. So a lot of providers are at capacity, so it can take quite a while to get some of these services in place. And again, there is a fine balance between OPWDD and what Medicaid covers and how you're able to get those things. But it's important to understand that if you qualify on both sides of the service, these are the things that you can have available to yourself. So we're going to talk about housing really quickly, which is which is a service that is available through OPWDD. Specifically, it depends on your needs, but they have different forms of housing supports and even housing subsidies that aren't directly through OPWDD, but OPWDD can help you secure. and things that are related to housing, like respite and community rehabilitation, which is generally related to your generally related to uh, um, which is generally related to your ability to live at home or in the community. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because there's 10 different services, but it's important to understand there are housing supports through agencies that can be available to you through OPWDD, and group home and other residential programs similarly in some cases fall under OPWDD if that's the direction that you would be going in, or a direction that might be appropriate for your family. Dayhab, this is where I want to take a minute to kind of explain um, uh, some of the nuances that have to do with transition. And when we talk about transition, I mean for again, students or young persons transitioning from um, a school setting to adulthood. There are many day have programs. There's a few tailored day have programs. And some are through programs like CUSAC or other places as well that are tailored toward young people working towards a job, young people working towards vocational services. And I guess the point, and there are directories out there that list some of these services. We're going to talk about providers specifically a little bit later in the training, but the point is that not all day hab services are created for the same purpose or for the same kind of goals. And that's something you should be aware of. It is very possible that even for someone who's looking for a job, day hab could be a really great opportunity to build some skills, maybe even to work. Some of the day habs are connected to through certain agencies, are connected through OPWDD supported employment and other kind of services. So you really have the ability to um, to find the right day hab that might be appropriate for you as a learning or training mechanism. So next slide is ComHab, Community Hab. This is something that we work with a lot with OPWDD providers to secure for our clients, and something that's pretty common, which is this is an agency that works with you to work on daily living skills, assistance with community inclusion, travel training, relationship building. So this is something often that isn't trained in the DOE, as much as we wish there was more of that service. And this service helps a young person or a student or a child adapt to what it's like to try to go to the store, try to do things in the community that are needed to support them with daily living. So community hab, very commonly asked. Unfortunately, there is a long waiting list. I mean, just with some of the clients that I've been working with, the community hab services can take, unfortunately, anywhere from 3 to 6 months, if not longer, to get into place because of waiting lists and other kinds of things. But it can be a really good thing to do as someone is looking to build independent living skills and daily living skills. So this is another service that's available through OPWDD. Again, just for time purposes, I'm going to keep moving a little bit because I have a lot of slides related to employment and kind of transition to work-based learning. But this is important for you to know, and there's a website listed here as well. Self-direction, I'm not going to cover a ton. Again, self-direction is very different. It's a really great potential if it's something you're looking for, where you do get a specific budget allocated to you that you can use for certain types of services. Generally, this is where the family or yourself, the individual, are responsible for coordinating services and supports on your own. So you have to work through a certain set of guidelines to secure community class, whether you want to use it on housing or home care, and it really is a person-centered kind of program that allows you to decide what you want to do. And what's important is that you don't have to be a traditional OPWD provider in order for somebody to utilize programs or services through self-direction. What's important to note, though, through self-direction is, unlike the traditional OPWD services or even the Medicaid-based services, their self-direction is not unlimited. So you get a concrete budget. That budget dictates kind of what you have to work with. You have a support team to kind of help you. You have care managers. You have a support broker. You have other fiscal intermediaries. So you have a lot of support in terms of what you can and cannot do and what the money can be spent on, but the money is limited in that fashion in the term that you get a budget. When applying for a self-direction budget, it could take quite a while. It could take at least a year. In some cases, I've seen it take more. So this is something important to think about if this is a route you're going to be going down. But it's very good because there's a lot of training programs, and some of them I'm going to talk about in the next few slides that go a long way in terms of being a good opportunity for students to learn more and to excuse me, there's a siren outside. To learn more and prepare themselves for a vocation or whatever the goal is. So some of the things, again, you can spend it on, whether it's a camp or a health club or other kinds of transportation. There's a variety of things that self-direction really lets you do. But there are caps and there are limits even per certain services and providers. And there are agencies out there that really specialize in self-direction. And in this aspect of OPWDD, the brokers and the FIs are incredibly knowledgeable. So we're not going to talk a ton about them. It's not something that Advocates for Children really does, but something important for you to know. And again, if your child is in the 11th, 12th grade or is 17, 18, this is something to think about really early on about how am I going to secure these services. So next, we're going to talk about supported employment in OPWDD a little bit. I covered some of this in our webinar back in March, where we talked about employment, even though that was more focused on Access VR and competitive employment, but it's still important to know, and I want to cover it here specifically under OPWDD. So OPWDD does have various employment services, including supported employment and pre-vocational services. This is just a few of the providers that are listed here that provide these services, whether it's AHRC or the Nicholas Center. These are great organizations that really go above and beyond in terms of finding employment and different kinds of training for students and young people who are interested in employment. So we're supported employment, which is kind of different than competitive employment. Just as background, competitive employment is where you're working in an integrated setting and you're kind of competitive employment is a more traditional form where a job is listed online and you post, you send in your resume, you go through an interview. That's competitive employment. Now, supportive employment is different. Supportive employment is kind of like a form of employment where you're working in an integrated setting often, but there are a lot of supports available to you. Sometimes you have a job coach, sometimes you have special training, sometimes the employer customizes the job to you in terms of what you're able to do. And the approach is really meant to help individuals with significant disabilities find and maintain employment. A lot of times building towards a supportive employment kind of arrangement takes many years. The student will go through training, they'll go through pre-vocational services, they'll go through different kind of elements of it as they work their way up toward a fully supported employment kind of arrangement. And the organizations have that do this, the community-based organizations I listed on the other page, they have relationships that are with employers and kind of places of employment where they know and have the proper supports for individuals with intellectual disabilities. So moving on, these are some more organizations that provide these services just for you to know and have when you have the slide deck. So OPWDD employment supports, again, these are primarily through the providers, but the CCOs can help you find the right provider. They have employment training and supports. They have supported employment. They have an employment training program, which really helps like find internships and do various different things. And they have pre-vocational services. So I think what this is really geared to say or understand is a lot of times a student, in your traditional track is going from high school to college to employment. For students with disabilities and the way the OPWDD employment is structured is there are many different paths. So if you're in a pre-employment phase and you're going to be doing certain skill development or training, you can be in that phase for a few years through OPWDD services and continue to make progress. Then you can move to an internship or some kind of other kind of training program or component that is available to you as you build those skills, and then further down work towards supported employment. And then I'm going to talk about customized employment in a minute, but maybe customized employment becomes a goal in the future. as you progress through these different channels. So really briefly, this isn't really for purposes of today, and there's a little bit of overlap, but I did want to. A lot of people talk about OPWDD and Access VR. Who's right? Where do I go? I mean, besides the fact that you can have both agencies at the same time, and I've certainly seen families do that. This is a little bit at a high level, and there's a little bit more overlap than even this would suggest. What's covered by both agencies, and what's covered exclusively by one or the other. And certainly, one of the things that a lot of times, even a family, a lot of times you can get most of what you need through OPWDD and the Medicaid-based arm of it, the Medicaid-based waiver. But when you start talking about college tuition, certain college support, direct work-related expenses that may not be covered, that's when you need Access VR. So a lot of times I'll say, hey, look, if you're just working with OPW, that's enough. But depending on your employment goal or your personal transition situation, if we knew your specific case, it might be a situation where we would say, hey, you know what, we do need additional Access VR services to cover that cost and fund it. So I'm getting down to my last few slides before I pass it off to my colleague, Juliet, to talk about adult decision making. But I did also want to mention customized employment. This is also a service that is offered in some ways in combination with OPWD and Access VR. This is where an agency like JobPaths works with a family to put together a customized employment plan. So maybe an employer is interested in bringing you on, but you have a different skill set than what the current job need is. They create a job role for you that is appropriate. And sometimes a job coach, which comes from the supported employment world, or another form of job coach may be connected to that plan. But these are all different options that you have. And I'm just giving you an example of one provider, but there's certainly more and others. So this is just about JobPath, but I'm going to keep going for the sake of time, the various things that they do and how they serve students with developmental disabilities. Really great organization. Again, they do have a long wait list. I mean, sometimes it could take a year or two to be able to get services through JobPath. But the world of customized employment and providers who are doing this is growing. So something to think about. Here, I just want to list a few programs that I want to highlight that are OPWD based. Some you have to pay through self-direction, which actually means they're not an OPWD provider or OPWD program, but a lot of people that I know use their self-direction budget. And some of these programs are more traditional supported employment or available through parent day hubs. So yes, she can is one agency like that is a retail and training employment program for young people with autism. There's also Invictus Bakery, which I'm going to have a few slides on just to highlight them. There's also Tech Kids Unlimited. This is really great computer science and technology skill building program for young people with autism and related disabilities. They have workshops, internships, summer programs, even employment. So again, they're not an OPWD provider, but it's something that people commonly, families or children commonly use their self-direction budget for. The self-direction rules are actually currently being in a state of change and are going through some flux, and I think it remains to be seen. But as of today, and as of what we've seen over the last few years, it's something that was available as a service. The Harvest Cafe, which is a program of a very special place, OPWDD agency, is another form of kind of employment, community-based employment, where you can work in a setting that has the proper supports, but gain food industry and food preparation skills for those with disabilities, in developmental disabilities. And then there's also similarly Spectrum Designs, which is also a program for those with autism or developmental disabilities, and it works in the apparel and retail space and teaches kids kind of skills around that and provides a significant form of employment. So Invictus Bakery, I'm just going to run through it real quick. It's located in Brooklyn, although they have, I believe, some satellite locations now. It offers work readiness and job training classes focused on creating kind of products and a lot of baking. And I've actually been there to visit, and it's a really great program. Has a lot of partnerships with various organizations like Microsoft and other places. And a lot of times the kids or young adults that participate in their programs do go on to either work directly with them or work in other means. Again, this is not an OPWD provider, but I think it's a unique and creative way that certain families have utilized the self-direction budget and other things available through OPWDD to get services to get services in maybe non-traditional fashions, but in fashions that work for them to move their children, their students or the young adults along towards their goal. Um, and just one more slide. Similarly, I like this slide a lot, not because it represents Invictus alone, but this is a lot of time when we work with young people with developmental disabilities and we're trying to find them a path to employment or whatever their goal is. It is progressive, right? So you start at one level, you build a certain level of skills, you move up, you match it with maybe some independent living skills, and everything moves along in a training kind of community-based, work-based learning fashion until you get to employment, whether it's supportive employment, competitive employment, or some other form of employment. So I'm just going to finish up with one more slide before I pass it to my colleague Juliet. These are just some resources that are available to you. What's interesting and why I highly encourage you to click on some of these when you get these slides is when you talk about community hab or day hab, you want to find providers that provide that service, even though the CCOs may be able to help you. A lot of these guides have a list of 10 or 20 or sometimes 5 providers that kind of service this area. Now, calling a provider if you don't have OPWDD eligibility doesn't really work like that. You have to work through your CCOs, but at least you can know and advocate for yourself. I mean, just like anything, whether it's the DOE or Access VR and OPWDD, the more you can advocate for yourself, the better you are. So the better informed you are, and you say, hey, I see this service and I would like this service for my child. Hey, can we secure that? That gives the care manager that you have a target to work towards. All care managers are not always created equal, or at least not as knowledgeable. And sometimes what you have to, when you're informed and you are part of the decision-making process, as well as the student themselves, whether it's you or your child, that tends to be a much better recipe for success in case that the care manager isn't as informed about your child, or the care manager just got your case and it might take them a few months to even figure out what's going on. If you know what you need and what's available out there, the more likelihood that you're going to have a successful transition and use OPWDD in a meaningful way. So I kind of leave it there. I'm going to pass it off to my colleague. If anyone has any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. We at Advocates for Children do some OPWDD advocacy. We help with certain cases. We help advocate for families. It's certainly on our transition team. So I, as the director of the post-secondary readiness transition team, it's something that is not the primary service we do, because there's a lot of organizations that are helping families with OPWDD. But in a case where a student is in the DOE still in high school, a lot of times they're not eligible for a lot of services at that point because they're still too young, or they don't qualify from an age perspective. That's where we get involved. We help with community hub. We help with certain other types of OPWDD services during those years, because once you get older and you fall under the auspices of kind of a large organizations like an ADAPT or someone else, they have their own care navigators and they have their own support systems that advocate for students within the system. But sometimes when they're younger, there are real gaps in terms of what students are missing, and how can we combine the services that OPWDD provides with the services of the IEP. And that's really the best balance in terms of how can we get you the most. Any parent, we talk to, how can I get my student or my child the most things that I can do? And it's a combination of services on my IEP, could be a combination of services through OPWDD, could be a combination of services through Access VR or community-based programs. So unfortunately, unlike in the world of the DOE, where everything is kind of within one classroom or one school, when you start talking about transition-based services, you're talking about many, many different providers that you have to work towards. So with that, I thank you all. I'm going to pass it to Juliet, who's going to cover adult decision making kind of briefly. And thank you so much.
I will start sharing my screen, but Alex, I just wanted to note that there is a question for you in the chat. Can you speak about the July 2023 ADM and the increased need to document a reasonable indication of need?
Yes, I'm going to get back to that question in a second, if you don't mind. I just need to fix the sun situation here because um, I'm like, uh, can't see out of my right eye. Give me 1 second. I'm going to come back for that. But go ahead, Julia.
Okay, so I'm going to talk really briefly about adult decision making, which is the process of determining who is going to be legally responsible for making decisions for your child once they turn 18 and become a legal adult. AFC we are by no means experts in this area, but because it is so closely tied to OPWDD, and other disability related services, we just wanted to give a brief overview of what the different options are when it comes to adult decision making, and then also provide some resources that folks can turn to for more assistance. So there are three buckets of adult decision making that we talk about. The first is the most restrictive bucket, which, excuse me, is 17A guardianship. This is when another adult, usually a relative, takes full guardianship over another person, which means that they make all of their decisions for them, including medical, financial, health related, etc. So this type of guardianship, there are a few different types of guardianship. 17A guardianship is meant for adults or soon to be adults who have intellectual and or developmental disabilities who are incapable because of their developmental or intellectual disability of making decisions on their own once they turn 18 and become a legal adult. This is really meant to focus on a very small subset of the population who are incapable of making those decisions. And typically, a family will start to begin the process of putting a 17A guardianship in place once that young person is about 17 and a half, to start gathering all of the documents that they will need because 17A guardianship requires filing a petition in surrogate's court. This can be done either on one's own or with an attorney. And it requires recent medical documentation of the disability as well as why that disability prevents that adult from being capable of making decisions for themselves. So generally, this is really supposed to be limited. It can be rejected if the court finds that that young person is actually capable of making decisions for themselves. So that is the first and most restrictive type of guardianship, or most restrictive type of adult decision making, I should say. Next, we have supported decision making, which is a type of adult decision making that came about in response to the restrictiveness of guardianship and the recognition that such a restrictive model is not always appropriate. There are many young people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are capable of making decisions for themselves as adults, but they might need more support in doing so. So, supported decision making recently became legal in New York State, which is really exciting. It's only legal in 8 states nationwide and in Washington, D.C. And what this means is that young people can now enter into either informal or more formal supported decision-making agreements with other people in their lives. And in those arrangements, they determine, what domain for support their supporter is going to help with. So, for example, the medical domain. They will also specify the type of support they would like to receive from their supporter in that domain, such as appointing that person as their healthcare proxy. And then delineating in the agreement how they will receive that support from the supporter. The process is really meant to be a collaborative one between the supported and the supporter, and they really both go through the entire process together. The young person can also appoint different people as supporters for different domains of their decision making, such as legal versus medical, versus financial. And right now, because it was so recently legalized in New York State in 2022, I believe, um, the way that people can enter into supported decision-making agreements or arrangements is by primarily enrolling in a pilot program that is funded by OPWDD. In that pilot program, the young person will go through a series of trainings, and then they will have a facilitator work with them and their designated adult supporters to create supported decision-making agreements. And as I said before, these can be either formal, like contract-like agreements, or they could be more informal things that are just the facilitator helps the group come to consensus about. And there is a link at the bottom of this page that you can click on when you get the slides for more information about supported decision making. And then finally, just a few other options for alternative decision-making vehicles. So if guardianship feels too restrictive, but you don't even know if you need the whole gamut of supported decision-making either, there are other ways that you can help a young person make decisions without becoming their guardian or entering into a supported decision-making arrangement. So for instance, a young person could still appoint another adult their power of attorney for legal decisions. They can still appoint a healthcare proxy for medical decisions, and they can do these just, as one-off arrangements to cover that domain of decisions. There also can be the appointment of a Social Security representative to help someone manage their Social Security benefits. And there are also special needs trusts to help with financial management as well. So these are all options that you could bundle together into a supported decision-making arrangement, whereby you're appointing adults to support you in these things and in these domains, or you could say, hey, I really only need help with, all my medical decisions. Like, I don't really get that stuff. It's kind of goes above my head. I would really like some extra support. And then, individually select the healthcare proxy as an added support that you're going to give yourself while still maintaining your rights as a legal adult. So these are other options that you can utilize to make it feel like you still have support as a legal adult, but you're retaining also your rights. So, as I said before, AFC is not, we do not specialize in guardianship. We do not we focus on the education realm. So we don't do guardianship applications or help families file petitions in guardianship court, but there are organizations that do. So NILAG, NILB, AHRC are three great resources. They all have services that provide support for guardianship and alternatives to guardianship. As I showed on the slide before, Supported Decision Making New York is a pilot that you can also directly reach out to for help with supported decision making. And finally, the New York Court's website also has a lot of resources online for families who might be filing a petition for guardianship pro se, or might otherwise be considering guardianship. Okay, so I will pause here to see if there are any questions.
Juliet, I'm just gonna go. I'm just gonna go back to that question about the
Okay.
recent kind of guidance from OPWDD on reasonable indication of need. So there was something that came out from OPWDD in July of last year, 2023, and what it specifically refers to is the eligibility criteria and kind of how to document the need. So individuals do have to demonstrate a reasonable indication of need for at least one or more services. And at least as OPWDD describes it, this is put into place to make sure that services are not allocated to those who may have other means that could effectively meet their needs, and that there has to be a component of preventing institutionalization. This requirement really serves as a safeguard to ensure that individuals are provided with necessary supports to live in the community rather than being institutionalized. And there's also an element of it that the need for services must be documented within the individual's life plan. And kind of some of what this relates to, at least as I understand it, we haven't worked on this a ton. I mean, a lot of we candidly advocates for children. A lot of our clients have a kind of clear need, but if you don't have a minimum requirement for one service, or you don't have certain elements, OPWD has said that you might not be eligible for services. And candidly, I mean, I think what was going on is a lot of parents were signing up for OPWD primarily for only self-direction, or for to get the self-direction budget that they could use on other things. But the need, or there might have been a diagnosis need, but the need for traditional services, or the need for kind of care management, or to be managed in various different ways. OPWD, or at least the government, felt like there was something slipping through the cracks, and there was greater utilization on one side than the other. And I mean, I could talk about it more. And if you have a specific question, I previously sent my information in the chat. Myself or someone else, I mean, we work with the IAC and other kind of experts on OPWD, can explain how this has really changed the eligibility criteria. It has certainly elevated the scope of review, but it's also kind of a new thing that's only been going on for the last year. And at least I myself, in our professional experience, have not um, um, does not uh, does something that we haven't had a ton of experience with. I think there's also a question about, does that mean there's a ceiling for family income for self-direction? I don't think there's a ceiling, because it's probably not something that the government can per se legally ask for. And I don't think that the ceiling is the element. I think they're just looking to put in more checks and balances, that whether you're a parent of, in a high income bracket or in a lower income bracket, that's not what's going to stop you. But at least if your child doesn't meet the elements of the traditional OPWD services, then in that case, you may not be eligible. And I think it's just one of the things they're trying to put in place, to see that parents don't just utilize OPWD for self-direction, um, but um, but kind of utilize the service as a whole. Now, when you talk about the fact that the services are not allocated to those who may have other means of support, that is kind of written into the guidance. I think that's something even we're waiting to see how that plays out, and how they choose to enforce that. I think what that means is that if there's a service that can provide this to you that isn't OPWDD and using Medicaid dollars, then let's give you that service. Now, does that mean that if your parents can pay?
Alex, you're muted.
I lost you. Does that mean you'd be ineligible? I think that's a different question. So by all means, if you would like to speak about this more, feel free to email myself or Juliet, and we'll certainly take a bigger look at this. And I know there was about 3 questions from 3 different people on this, so thank you.
Okay, I'm going to drop a link in the chat to a survey that we ask everyone to fill out. Let us know how this presentation was, what we can do better moving forward. We always really appreciate your feedback. So if you can just take a couple of minutes to fill it out, we greatly appreciate it. And otherwise, as Alex mentioned before, we have a helpline that's open Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Don't hesitate to reach out. We also have a form online on our website, advocatesforchildren.org, that you can use to submit questions. So don't hesitate to reach out to us in any of those ways. And as Alex said, he's also dropped his email in the chat. And then finally, if you'd like, we have weekly, it says monthly, but they're actually weekly updates, Blackboard bulletin that you can sign up for on our website as well. that give kind of the latest updates on what workshops we're holding, what's happening in the education world in New York City, and other relevant information. Okay, I think we don't seem to be getting any further questions, so I'll stay on for a few more minutes. But thank you all for joining, and you know, if you can take a few minutes to fill out the survey, we really appreciate it. Okay, I am going to end the webinar now. Thank you again, everyone, for joining, and don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions.